Hello, this is FIDE Master Josiah Stearman with Round 6 coverage of the All-Women's Norm Tournament hosted by Berkeley Chess School. Here we have a game between FIDE Master Anya Wang with the white pieces versus WIM Agnieszka Matras Clement with the black pieces. It was a tough game played throughout, which ended in an instructive endgame. Here, Annie started with d4, and we get into a mainline Slav defense. Here, Agnieszka played the sideline of knight a6, and it continued with theory. Here, after queen e2, h6, the normal move is e4, which has been played 36 times, but Annie decided to play bishop to d2, which is fine as well. The game continued castles, rook ac1, queen e7, e4, bishop h7, knight f3, threatening e5 to win a piece. Obviously, black went out of that with bishop c7. Here Annie played rook cd1, which I kind of question a little bit. I think maybe this rook on f1 is better placed here, as this rook also controls the semi-open c file. And this rook here, if you want to put it on e1, I don't really see much use of it on e1. Another idea here for white could have been e5, and after knight to d5, knight e4, potentially putting a knight on d6. And white really, black doesn't really want to trade off on e4, as white can get some attacking chances along this diagonal if this white bishop were to ever get on that diagonal. But instead, rook cd1 was played, rook fd8, bishop c1, and here we see a thematic break in the Slav, in these lines of the Slav, with c5. White decides to take, queen takes, bishop e3. And here I think black should have put the queen back onto e7, as the queen's a little bit more safe there and not going to get kicked around as much. Because after queen a5, bishop d2, this queen was forced back to c5, and after knight b5, this queen is a little awkward here on c5, and after bishop a5, black's pieces are a little bit uncoordinated. e5 was played, knight f d5, knight d6, and we see this beautiful knight placed on d6. Rook to a b8, rook a to b8, guarding b7. Bishop takes d5 was played, e takes d5 was played. On queen takes d5, clearly bishop takes b4 wins a piece. And on knight takes d5, after rook to c1, queen to b6 must be played to guard the bishop. And then after knight to c4, white wins some material. So e takes d5 is forced here. Rook to c1 was played, and after queen to b6, bishop to d6. This queen is forced to a6, in which after queen takes, pawn takes, white temporarily wins a pawn with bishop takes a7. Knight to d3 was played, and we trade off a pair of rooks here and a pair of pieces. And we get into an endgame where white is up a pawn, but black has the bishop pair as well as some threats on b2, which are pretty hard to defend. White plays rook to c5, bishop d8, h3. It's key to note here that rook takes b2 does not work because of rook to c8, and we are winning a piece here. So black plays bishop to e4, guarding the d5 pawn. Rook to c6 is played, attacking a6, bishop b6, guarding it. b4 is played, and then black takes on f3, g takes f3, doubling up these pawns. And after bishop to d4, it looks like black will be recovering a pawn. After f4, rook takes b4, rook takes a6, rook to b2. Black recovers their lost pawn on f2. King g2, rook a8 first. King h7, king to g2, rook takes f2, king to g3 is played. And at the moment, f7 is threatened, so black plays bishop to e3, creating the threat of her own. f5 is played, and after rook f1, here I think Annie could have really sealed the game here, and I think could have achieved a very large advantage after a5. And simply the idea is this rook cannot move off this f5 pawn, because after, say, rook a1, which would be ideal place for the rook guarding this pawn, knight takes f7 is played, and black is in deep trouble. So instead, black must play some other waiting moves like h5 or g5, in which this pawn can easily go up the board. Instead, white played knight takes f7, which I think is a little hasty, because after rook takes f5, e6, bishop to c5, this pawn isn't going anywhere. Rook to c8 is played, bishop to b4, rook to b8, trying to kick the bishop off of this diagonal. Bishop to e1 check is played, king to g4 and g6. And e5 does not work because, e7 does not work because of h5 checkmate. So knight 6 h7 h6 is played, which is a nice move because after king takes h6, e7, and you cannot stop the queening of the pawn without giving up material. So black must play rook to e5, putting the rook behind the pawn. Knight to f7 is played with, again, rook takes e6 is not available because of knight g5 check, winning the rook. So instead, rook e4 check is played, kicking the king back to f3. And after king g7, now we are threatening to take on e6 with the rook. White plays knight g5, guarding it. Rook e5 is trying to kick away the knight. King f4 is played. And now black finds a nice move in bishop g3 check. And after something like king g4, trying to keep guard of the knight, black can play rook takes g5 check. And after king takes, bishop takes, the tables have turned and black is now winning. So white is forced to take here. Rook takes, and here we have an interesting endgame, which is white is up a pawn. Should be drawn, but it's still a very hard draw from here. Rook to e5, rook b6 guarding the pawn, d4. And so here's where black's counterplay comes with this d pawn. So white plays rook to d6, trying to win this pawn. King f6, and in lieu of that, must give up the e pawn for the d pawn. And here we see this is where black starts to tail off a little bit. And here black, I think the easiest way for black to achieve a draw would have been rook h5, and after king g3, king takes e6, in which the a pawn could not go up the board after because the rook is guarding it. But here I think black went for a little bit inferior defense on rook takes e6, but it's still a draw. And after a5, rook f4 check was played first, king to g5, and now a5, rook a6 still drawn. And after rook a4, here black played the fatal move, which was king h5. I think black's idea was that if this king crosses this rank, then king h4 would be played, and then winning this pawn, and then sacking this rook for the pawn on a5, and then this pawn would give enough counterplay to make a draw. But I think what she missed was after king to e3, g5, king to d3, here actually she was forced to resign, as this king would just come in and actually say something like here was I don't know, any waiting move was played, and even say the king was already on h5 square trying to go king h4, a king b4, and automatically you're losing the rook with check. So I think this was an oversight by black, and also she was short on time as well. But this was how the game ended, was after g5, king to d3, black resigned here. But instead, I think a quite instructive draw here is cutting the white king off with king to f5 or king to f6. Really, you just need to stop this king from its route to b5. And after, say, even king b6, king e4, king e6, and now black has achieved the opposition. And this rook really can't really do anything to force the king off, even some waiting moves like h4, king to d6. And really what black needs to do is just to keep this king from coming to b5. So king to c6, king to c4, say, and now actually just a king to b7 even as a draw. After something like king b5, we move this rook over to f6, and we get this king in front of the pawn, which is very key, because if this rook moves over here, which would be ideal to give a check on e7, black can play rook f5 check and pick up this pawn, or even take a6. So this was a quite instructive endgame here, and a quite strong game played by both players, but in the end, Annie Wang came out victorious in a nice endgame played by white. So that will conclude my game of the day for round 6. Tune in to chess24.com to follow the ensuing rounds, as Irina Krush is currently in the lead of the tournament, and we'll see if she'll be able to close out the tournament and take first place. All right, thank you, and goodbye.